Fears and phobias. I think it's safe to say most of us have them, don't they? That survival instinct and the desire to avoid pain and suffering is just a natural and normal part of the human condition. Some fears can be so extreme and so irrational that they actually stop people from functioning in any kind of normal way. I know of one person on Social Security disability who has a very extreme fear of getting cancer, of birds, and of being targeted by the mafia, which is absolutely ridiculous because there's no reason the mafia would ever target that person. They're basically not anybody that the mafia would even take notice of. And so fears can be irrational and extreme, and they can stop people from functioning entirely. However, I think the phobias that most of us have actually do have a rational basis. And I would like to talk about some of those and the normal, what I would consider appropriate responses to them. Now, you all know that I love to fly. I've loved to fly for many years. But some people do have a fear of flying called aerophobia. Now, if you have that particular fear, I would probably work hard if I knew you to help you try to overcome it, because flying is just about the safest way to travel that there is. There are far more deadly and dangerous accidents that happen on the ground, driving cars and vehicles and so forth, and watercraft. There are far more of those than there are flying disasters. And yet, aerophobia does have a rational basis. As much as I love it, I'll never forget the first time that I ever went up in a plane. And there was a certain nervousness, a certain anxiety in seeing the ground fall away for the first time. And you realize that there is nothing between that aircraft and the ground. And it evokes a certain anxiety, and even to this day I can at times feel a little bit of anxiety on takeoffs and landings, and mostly it's exhilarating, but I can understand if people are nervous about it, because air disasters do in fact happen. What people fail to realize, I think, is they are nowhere near as common as traffic accidents and watercraft accidents. It really is a safe way to travel, and yet I can understand that innate fear that people have of flying. There is a rational basis to it because of something called gravity. So when people are afraid of flying, that's not completely irrational. It does have a rational basis to it. Now, I'd like to talk about another one that's very common, and that is fear of dangerous wildlife. The first one I want to get over with, ophidiophobia, fear of snakes, which happens to be one of my fears. Now, there's a very good reason for people to fear snakes, because there are a variety of species all over the world that can kill and seriously injure people. In the United States, rattlers, copperheads, and coral snakes. In other parts of the world, there are even more dangerous species than that, even more deadly. Cobras, fer-de-lance, and in Africa, the black mamba, extremely dangerous. Now, I know that there are a lot of species that are not dangerous. In Hawaii, you don't have any snakes. In Ireland, there are none. In the UK, there is only one venomous species, that's an adder, and it's actually very rare. But in many parts of the world, you have these extremely dangerous serpents, and they can kill. And in the United States, there is only one antivenom, as far as I know at this point, called crofab. It is extremely expensive. Now, you will get treated. You will definitely get treated, but you'll also get, very likely, a very huge bill, because crofab is very, very expensive. Antivenoms in other parts of the world are less expensive in those countries, and there are also different species. But the fear of snakes is very rational. I'm the type who thinks that they all need to be basically just run over or shot or disposed of in some way. That may not be practical. I guess it could even be harmful, but that is my feeling toward them, because they are so extremely dangerous. And people who are bitten with venomous snakes aren't, most of the time, they're not expecting it or or daring to do it. It's just an accident. So it's a very realistic fear. So as far as snakes go, I know that there are ways that you can identify dangerous from non-dangerous species, but I'm not going to hang around and find out. You see, one thing about our fears, where the fear actually exceeds the real danger, that is a desire to avoid certain things at all cost, or at most cost, and that actually is quite reasonable. I, for years, was a safety and loss prevention man with a company that I worked for. And you know the best way to deal with accidents, it's avoidance. So the fact that our fears sometimes outstrip the real dangers, that is actually rational. It has a rational basis. Now there's other dangerous wildlife that people can be afraid of, and rightly so. Lions, tigers, elephants. These animals are so large and so powerful that a single one of them in good health is vastly more powerful than any human being on the planet, and they can do immense damage. They can kill. Some of you might remember that in Las Vegas there used to be an act called Siegfried and Roy, illusionists, magicians, and they worked with big cats, specifically white tigers. And you'd have these huge cats just feet away from the audience, out there on stage, and hardly anything to control them other than trainers, and they got by with it for a very long time. But that long-running Las Vegas show and most of their career in doing this came to an end when Roy Horn was critically injured by a white tiger named Manticore in October of 2003. And despite years and years of working with these animals and having a great relationship with them, it only takes that one time. And that one time happened. And it almost killed him. And, I know that there are people who like to keep wild animals as pets, but wild animals still a wild animal. It only takes one time. So fear of dangerous wildlife, yes, they can kill. That is very, very rational, and it's good to avoid situations like that. I don't think I could ever be a Siegfried or a Roy and work with them so casually or keep dangerous animals as pets, because they are very dangerous. So fear of dangerous wildlife is very reasonable, and I think the response of most people should be to avoid those things. Claustrophobia, fear of small spaces. Where does that come from? Well, it's actually very rational. It's a fear of being trapped and unable to get out of somewhere, so that you might not even survive. That's a rational fear, because people get trapped in auto accidents every day, and they're seriously injured, and they can't get out, and they have to be rescued with the jaws of life. Mines collapse, and people get trapped in them. Sometimes things go wrong with submarines, and people get trapped with the oxygen running out, and various ways that people can be trapped. Elevators can fail. People can get stuck on elevators. Now, I know people don't like to think about this, but the most common reason for elevator failure is power outages, which actually can happen, and you're stuck there and somebody has to come rescue you, and that is a scary situation. And so claustrophobia does in fact have a rational basis. There is reason to be afraid of that. So dangerous animals, claustrophobia, and fear of flying, all of these are things that do in fact have a rational basis. Fear of guns. Well, there are ways to handle guns that, if you do them, nothing's going to happen, but still they can kill people. They can and do kill people. And that is a reason I handle guns, but I'm extremely careful and always just a little bit on edge, because I know what they can do. You see evidence of what they can do all the time. So fear of firearms is not irrational. It's as rational as fear of explosives are. Now, here's another one that's actually very common, and it too has a rational basis. fear of sharp objects, and I'm specifically talking about needles. But the fact is that sharp objects can seriously hurt you, and they can seriously damage you, and they can seriously cause a lot of pain. And so fear of needles is part of that fear of sharp objects, which can hurt and which can cause serious problems. And if a needle is put in the wrong place, it can cause serious problems. And so let me say this: anti-vaxxers are some of the stupidest people around. You know, I think they're absolutely idiots. They don't believe in science. It's well proved. And I think that people should always get vaccines, and yet there is legitimate fear of needles. I don't like needles, but personally I've never fainted when stuck with a needle. I understand that some people do, and when that happens, it's largely an involuntary reaction that extends from that innate fear of sharp objects. It actually is very rational. Now, I say that's never happened to me. If I say that there's no way that that could ever happen and get real smug about it, say I could never faint from a needle stick, next thing you know, I'm the one out cold having to be revived with, you know, smelling salts and being fanned and all that, and I would deserve that too. But it is a rational fear, and it affects people in different ways. It is actually very common. It's an extension of that fear of sharp objects. However, that shouldn't stop people from getting vaccines, because it's very, very important to get vaccines. They can save your life. I may have mentioned in the past that we here at our office facility offer flu shots to everybody who works here and also their dependents, and we're also able to offer vaccines here. And to the best of my knowledge, no one's ever had a serious problem with a needle. But if they did, I would understand. It makes sense to me. I think we would all understand. So if a person is likely to pass out from that, it'd be nice to know it in advance. Because if you're pretty sure that's going to happen, then I and another one of our people, we can also be back there and be ready to help if the person does collapse. And that would be in a very non-judgmental way, because when that happens, it's involuntary. It's something that people can't help, and it's a rational fear. It's an extension of that fear of sharp objects. Now, if it did happen and someone were to give them a hard time about it, that would be a very good way to end up scrubbing toilets for about the next month, because it's a rational fear. It's not something that should be laughed at or made fun of, unless they themselves find it kind of funny. But a lot of people wouldn't, because passing out in front of other people, that's a lot of times embarrassing situation, one of the most embarrassing situations. But even though that's never happened to me, it's a fear that I understand. So I've just listed some fears that are very common, phobias that very, very common. And if you examine those, you find that there is a rational basis for all of them. And it's true that sometimes our fears go beyond what is likely to happen. But if you stop and think about it, that's rational too, because avoidance is in fact the best way to stop accidents from happening. Now, you shouldn't avoid vaccines, because the danger of that avoids the danger of, passing out in front of other people. That is a worse danger than, fainting from a shot. So those shouldn't be avoided, but it's something that people should understand. So when people tell you that they have fears of this, that, or the other, it's important to realize that a lot of those fears are in fact rational. The desire to avoid those things that goes beyond the danger is actually rational, because it's a way to avoid. It's a psychological way to avoid. So the response to people when they tell you you have various fears ought to be basically understanding and kindness, and trying to work with them to accommodate those fears, which are in fact rational. So, I don't judge people over those common fears. I really don't. Now, if Teresa were watching this video, she'd probably throw in something like, "And that's why we all love you," which is a nice thing to hear, but at the same time, it kind of bothers me that common decency, just treating people right, is so unusual that someone ought to be praised for it. You know, there was this movie, the famous story, The Christmas Carol, and the spirit of Christmas Past takes the Scrooge, the bad guy, back to a period of time where he was working for this guy who ran some kind of a shop or a cottage industry or something like that. I forget his name, Fizzywig or something like that. And he was hosting this huge party on Christmas Eve. And he shuts down the business. No more work. It's Christmas. It's time to celebrate. And, you know, there was this discussion about what a great, kind, wonderful thing he did. And the spirit of the Ghost of Christmas Past said, you know, is doing the right thing such a big deal that he should be praised for it? Is being kind and decent to people so uncommon that people should be praised for it? If that's true, that's kind of a shame. But I happen to be one of those people who believes, and I could list a lot of other fears, that we should try to accommodate and try to be understanding about the fears and phobias that people have, because so many of those actually do have a rational basis. There is a reason for them, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. Sometimes the fear actually does outstrip the danger of what is likely to happen. But when you think about it, that is rational too, because the best way to avoid danger, to avoid bad things happening, is to avoid the danger as much as possible. And actually, the fainting from shots is a kind of avoidance. It is actually a kind of avoidance because it kind of takes the pain away for a few minutes. And I don't mean to laugh at that because it's actually not funny at all, and it wouldn't be treated as funny if it happened, you know, unless the person found it funny. But fears and phobias, they're common, they are rational, and I firmly believe that the proper response when someone tells you they have a fear of something, most of the time, is to be understanding and try to accommodate and recognize that you probably have your own fears and phobias, which are very different because people are different. And just because you don't fear something doesn't mean that someone else does. And just because someone else doesn't fear something doesn't mean that you do. We're all different, and we have a lot of fears that do in fact have a rational basis. And so just be understanding and kind and try to accommodate those as best you can. It's the thing to do, as far as I'm concerned. Have a very good day.